All right, let's jump right into this. Today's explainer is absolutely not about dusting off some old history books. It's about taking a 500-year-old framework and using it as the ultimate diagnostic tool for modern system resilience. We're looking at Chapter 10 of Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince, but we aren't going to read it as a manual for 16th century rulers. Instead, we're going to look at it as a complete masterclass in structural engineering, a full system audit for how power, organizations, and honestly, even our own personal systems actually survive when put under extreme pressure. So, I really want you to think about this question for a second. What happens when the bailout never comes? It's kind of the ultimate rhetorical stress test, right? Because we go through life, we build businesses, and we design networks, just assuming that if things go entirely sideways, an ally, a third-party service, or maybe a central bank is going to step in. But Machiavelli totally challenges our core assumptions about what makes a system actually strong. He asks us to imagine a scenario where every single safety net is suddenly cut. So the crucial point is this. True strength is not about the sheer size of your empire or your market cap or the size of your network. True strength is defined entirely by your perceived survivability under isolation. Machiavelli's core thesis is just beautifully ruthless. Size literally doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is your isolation capability. Can you stand alone when the music stops? Okay, here's the roadmap for our system audit today. We're going to strip away the 16th century politics to reveal the pure structural mechanics of power. We'll start with the illusion of strength, then move into the isolation stress test, and explore the psychology of deterrence. After that, we'll break down why systems collapse, apply it all in Machiavelli and modern life, and finally wrap up with the modern networked flaw. Section 1. The illusion of strength. This is all about perception versus reality. You know, it is incredibly easy to confuse outward might, like having a massive army or a giant corporate headquarters, with actual underlying structural durability. But there's this hidden structural rule running through the entire text, which is real strength is what remains when external support is removed. Everything else, and I literally mean everything, is just an illusion. If your success or your security or your day-to-day operations rely heavily on someone else, an ally, a platform, a key supplier, then you don't actually own your strength. You're basically just borrowing it. Machiavelli breaks down a state's real strength into a few core variables. And notice what's on this list. It's about internal military capability, being able to rely purely on your own resources, maintaining elite cohesion right at the top, and keeping the loyalty of your population during a major crisis. And critically, it's about your external dependency level. These are the exact vulnerabilities that enemies are constantly probing. They aren't looking at your strongest fortress. They're hunting for your hidden dependencies. They are looking for that precise moment you have to ask for help, kind of like a global supply chain completely freezing just because one single ship gets stuck in a canal. Moving to Section 2, the isolation stress test. This is our system audit framework. Now, think of this phase less like a battlefield assessment and more like a brutal, objective financial credit score for your sovereignty. Machiavelli proposes a three-part stress test to evaluate actual strength. First up, can the state defend itself alone? Second, can it withstand siege conditions, meaning can it survive when completely cut off from the outside world? And third, can it mobilize its internal resources without any outside dependency whatsoever? Passing all three of these conditions without needing a rescue is the only real way to prove true sovereignty. If you fail even one, you're vulnerable. Right at the heart of this stress test is one absolutely critical factor: internal coercive capacity. This is essentially the control node of survival. It's the single most important determinant of whether you pass the isolation test. If a system cannot internally enforce order, direct its own defense, and literally compel its parts to work together when isolated, well, it's going to shatter from the inside out way before an enemy even breaches the walls. Section 3. The psychology of deterrence. Let's talk about perception-based defense. Now, what's really interesting about this is how we shift from physical, measurable strength to the psychological underlayer of power. Check out this comparison. On one hand, we've got deterrence bias. Human beings, and by extension their organizations, naturally avoid attacking systems that just appear completely self-sufficient. It's just too risky. But then we have the signal substitution effect. Smart rulers understand that projecting an unbreakable image, a pure display of strength, can actually replace the need for actual strength in the minds of their enemies. Weak rulers, on the flip side, suffer from this huge overconfidence illusion. They misjudge their own resilience because they've never actually stress-tested their own dependencies. And that boils down to a truly fascinating psychological truth. Power is obeyed because it looks unbreakable, not necessarily because it is unbreakable. If you can perfectly project self-sufficiency and mask your dependencies, you can effectively deter threats without ever having to fire a single shot. Section 4. Why systems collapse. These are the failure conditions. So what happens when the mask inevitably slips? Because systems almost never break down when things are calm. And this brilliantly illustrates the feedback loops that govern system dynamics. Take a look at the positive stability loop. A strong internal force creates deterrence, which leads to fewer attacks and ultimately just more stability. It perfectly reinforces itself. But look at the negative instability loop. If you rely on external support, it immediately signals perceived weakness to your rivals. That leads to increased probing of your defenses, which then triggers actual instability. A state, or honestly any system, is truly only as strong as its weakest dependency on an outside force. When a failure does happen, it unspools in a highly predictable, incredibly dramatic sequence. Step 1. There's an over-reliance on external actors, allies, maybe mercenaries, or third-party vendors. Step 2. A sudden stress event occurs. Step 3. Under that pressure, the external dependency is fully exposed when the ally pulls back or the vendor goes down. Step 4. Panic sets in and internal cohesion totally fragments. And finally, Step 5. Complete system collapse. The absolute key takeaway here is that collapse happens under pressure, not in peace. The weakness was literally always there. The stress event just revealed it. All right, Section 5, Machiavelli in Modern Life. Time for some cross-domain transfer. Let's aggressively shift gears for a minute. We've been talking a lot about states and rulers, but this 500-year-old isolation framework applies to virtually every modern industry today. Think about trading. A strong system is a portfolio that stays resilient during a massive market crash, whereas a weak system fails during liquidity stress simply because it was over-reliant on leverage, which is basically borrowed external support. In chess, a strong position withstands an opponent's initiative organically, while a weak one collapses the moment it's forced into a self-reliant defense without any tactical tricks. In cybersecurity, a robust architecture keeps operating even if third-party services go down under attack, but a weak system fails instantly due to external API dependencies. Margin calls, cyber attacks, board tactics, they literally all follow the exact same isolation rules that Machiavelli outlined for medieval city-states. Section 6. The modern networked flaw. Let's do a ruthless critique. Now, to be rigorous, we have to flip the script. Where does Machiavelli's mental model actually fall short in today's world? Because while it's structurally brilliant, his model has some massive blind spots. First, he assumes a very static definition of strength, whereas modern hybrid warfare heavily blurs the lines between internal and external conflict. Second, he completely ignores the depths of modern informational warfare, where perception can be fully manipulated independently of real on-the-ground capacity. Third, he deeply underestimates economic interdependence as a legitimate form of strategic strength. And finally, his theory suffers from major survivorship bias. He focused entirely on historically isolated states that survived, completely ignoring states that thrived precisely through integration. And this is the fundamental clash. Absolute independence was Machiavelli's ideal. He equated total independence with strength. But the modern strategic reality is controlled interdependence. Today, states, corporations, and even us as individuals often gain massive resilience, not by isolating ourselves, but by strategically networking our alliances, integrating our economies, and building overlapping support systems so that a failure in one area doesn't trigger a total collapse. Let's move to our conclusion and see how this builds up to the final takeaway, and it is simply this. A system's true strength is only visible under isolation stress conditions. Even with the incredibly networked reality of the modern world, this dominant pattern still holds immense value. Whether we're talking about geopolitical sanctions, your reliance on cloud computing, or just your personal finances, your actual baseline of strength is exactly what remains when you are totally cut off. Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. Look at your own systems right now, your business, your portfolio, your team. If your external support vanished tomorrow, if the bailout never came, would your system survive the isolation test? It is a tough question, for sure, but as we've learned today, it's really the only one that truly measures your resilience. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep analyzing, keep stress testing, and keep learning.